Hello and welcome to Lamestream, a weekly show that aims to guide you through the crisis in media and how it's changing everything. I'm Osman Faruqi. I'm here with my co-host Scott Mitchell. We've got a very special election episode for you, sifting through the results of the federal election on Saturday, helping you make sense of it all. First though, Scott, how are you doing, my friend?
Man, I'm doing really well. I'm not too dusty after last night. We had our launch/election party in Melbourne, which we've mentioned a couple of times on the show, but it was such an amazing crowd. So many just lovely people came out. I think you knew more of them than I did. I had a few friends there, a few in the room, but just met so many lovely people. You have any funny feedback on the night? Anyone come up to you, say anything in particular?
I knew a lot of the people there, but honestly, I would say maybe half the crowd were just either weird nerds in Fitzroy who wanted to go to an election party, or perhaps lamestream heads that we hadn't met yet. So it was an awesome vibe. You know, we booked that party before we had launched this podcast, and in fact, it became the kind of impetus for us to get this show off the ground in time for the election. But had a really wonderful time. Thank you to everyone who went along. Thank you to the Punters Club for hosting. We made some bold announcements on the night, Scott. I think maybe the funnest thing we did was around 7:45 decide to get up on stage and call the election before Anthony Green, before the networks, all the newspapers, and turns out our call was right. So that was pretty fun.
That was fun. Yeah, I had one woman come up to me and tell me that she'd brought her mum along to the event. In the idea had sold it to her as it'll be more fun than sitting at home watching it by yourself. And she said her mum was loving our coverage during the night and loving your calls. Apparently her mum was, texting away to her group chats saying, "Oh, I'm hearing this, I'm at this thing and they're telling me that the scrutineers in this area for this party are saying this," and that kind of thing. Amazing.
It was awesome.
Love to see that.
And as a result of us hosting the party, we definitely watched a lot less of the coverage than we normally would have if we're just at home or even at work covering the election in previous jobs we've had. But we did have a couple of TVs on. We had the big TV tuned to the ABC, and we had a smaller one tuned to 9. My vibe, interested in your take on this, nothing too dramatic or exciting on either one. Anthony, it was his last ever broadcast on the ABC. Some tech issues. The screen wasn't working for a significant chunk of the time, but that kind of felt appropriate because Anthony always sort of has those issues and he gets very flustered.
It was also great to see him, if you're going to see Anthony Green for the last time, you want to see him sort of flustered, looking over his spectacles, wearing that kind of wacky tie. It felt like nice to see him in that kind of flustered element. That's the Anthony we love.
Totally. And Channel 9, we were interested in what their election night graphic was going to be this time when an MP lost their seat. They had the dunk tank. And the clip that went viral, I saw a lot of people sent me this one, was Peter Dutton getting dunked in the dunk tank when he lost his seat. People had a lot of fun with that one as well. But I think the interesting thing is because the result was called earlier than I think most people expected because it was such an emphatic victory for the Labor Party, people kind of ran out of things to talk about. And I think by about 10 p.m., the ABC just sort of said goodbye and started playing historic election coverage and like documentaries featuring John Howard and Julie Gillard. And I know that this is hard and there's a lot of effort that goes into these broadcasts and a lot of people put a lot of time in behind the scenes. It's weird to me when this is probably the night of the year where most normal people who might not watch ABC News or kind of any political coverage would tune in. You didn't have a backup plan for if things end early. You couldn't find a more interesting or relevant show or even have like a panel of comedians or just something in the election night sort of flavor, even if you don't want to talk about results. I thought that was an odd move for the ABC.
I mean, you say that, but I've watched a Victorian state election with you that ended very early, and our plan was to watch the entire 2007 election on YouTube, where you can watch it for like a 6-hour clip. And I think we watched that for like 2 hours. So
I'm not saying what we want to do. I'm saying what the normal people want to watch. Scott, one thing we were doing on Saturday night at the party, we're plugging our newsletter relentlessly. And thank you to the people who came along and signed up.
Yeah, I saw some sign-ups come through at about 2:35 a.m. on my on my email, which is lovely to see. And yeah, look, becoming a paid subscriber is the best way to support Lamestream and help us to continue to make this podcast and do independent journalism. So head to lamestream.com.au. During our launch month, we've got a special price that works out to $5 a month if you buy a year's subscription up front. So like a whole year of content from us, exclusive stories, analysis and commentary on our newsletter for just $5 a month is a pretty good deal, I reckon, Oz.
It's a bargain deal. All right, today on the show, we're going to break down the top-level results, starting with the disastrous result for the coalition. People thought Peter Dutton was going to have an uphill battle this election, but I don't think anyone was really predicting the total catastrophe that emerged. So what does the wipeout say about the media's analysis of this election, and how do they miss it? We're also going to take a look at some of the interesting contests outside of the big Labor coalition head-to-head battle, including the performance of the Greens, who look to have lost at least a couple of seats, and their leader, Adam Ban, is still fighting for survival in Melbourne. And we'll take a look at the performance of the Teals and other independents and some of the other races that we wanted to highlight before the election. First, though, Scott, let's talk through the top line results, right? So at the moment, there's still a lot of counting to go. Things can shift in either direction, a couple of seats here or there. But Labor's on track to win at least 85 seats, which would be their best result since World War II. The Coalition are currently on 37 seats. They could gain a few more, but that still would be their worst result since World War II, and I think since Menzies actually created the modern Liberal Party. But I think what's interesting is that even though Labor did get a small swing towards them, which was kind of like maybe a little bit better than what the polls were suggesting, the election continued this overall decline in the combined major party vote total. Between them, they got about 66% of the vote, and there was more growth in the support for minor parties and independents, a trend that we've been seeing the last few elections. They collectively drew around a third of the vote. Kind of what that has boiled down to in the House of Representatives is, out of the 150 seats that are up for grabs, 40 of those, so nearly a third of those now, are non-Labor coalition contests. So we're talking seats like Greens versus Labor, Labor versus Independent, Coalition versus Independent. It's a really significant structural shift in how Australian politics is operating. And so even though Labor's got this comfortable majority, they got this swing to them, there's still this sense that a lot of Australians are feeling disconnected from the political system. But the story of this election is the total unprecedented collapse of the coalition, and Peter Dutton losing his own seat as well, in the first opposition leader in history to lose his seat at a general election. What happened, Scott?
Yeah, look, I think Dutton, and we talked about this at the beginning of last week. Dutton ran on issues that I think are a big deal inside the right wing, and there is actually a media element to this where these issues are a big deal inside the right-wing media, but not really relevant to most Australians, I think. And, you talked about it last week when it came to Welcome to Country and how that was something that was sort of whipped up by a small but kind of powerful and influential group of people and journalists and kind of political issue makers. But, you could say the same of, things like nuclear power, this Doge-style slashing of public service, the idea of working from home, all of those issues that Dutton based this campaign around are Sky News issues. They matter inside that bubble, and Peter Dutton was foolish enough to think that what matters to that insular world represents what matters to Australians at large, I think. And last night's result, I think, is kind of proof that this right-wing media ecosystem is really irrelevant when it comes to what most Australians care about. Interestingly, I think there were some examples of this going on even on election night and on Sunday morning. A lot of them were coping with being very, very wrong about what had happened if you tuned into Sky News on election night. There was a lot of coping. Peter Credlin, the former Tony Abbott chief of staff, of course, she's an on-air commentator for Sky News, and she's been arguing for 3 years that Dutton and the coalition should fight this campaign on culture war issues, and arguing that there's this silent majority of Australians out there who really care about this stuff. Oz, I wanted to play a little bit of election night coverage and commentary from her. This is when she was confronted with how this strategy that she'd advocated for had gone on election night by Minister for Employment Murray Watt from Labor, who was on the panel.
I think the really interesting thing will be tonight whether the strategy that Peter Dutton pursued, and I know you encouraged him to pursue, Peter, of ditching the teal seats for the outer suburbs, whether it pays off.
Don't verbal me, Murray.
Is that a
I have never advocated ditching the teal seats.
You've certainly advocated for going after the outer suburbs.
I've always advocated, coming from a poor, backward part of regional Victoria, that those places cannot and should not be forgotten by the Liberal Party.
Well, the strategy will be very interesting.
Mate, your mouth is writing cheques your brain can't cash.
Peter, your response to my point on Kooyong was incredible.
Yeah, that was Peter Credlin's sort of response to kind of getting called a little bit on the strategy she'd advocated for. What do we make of that, Oz?
I mean, there's few moments where you really relish being a Labor guy on Sky News, surrounded by a bunch of like super right-wing people. But when you're watching their strategy and their Liberal Party tank, and you're the one guy there, you can put up with that, right? Because that's a meltdown from Peter Credlin, predicated on the fact that their strategy failed. It's not an insightful comment. It's not really. She's losing the argument, and Murray Watt is just relishing and eating up the time he's having on that show.
And later in the night, she ended up saying that she thought that the Liberal Party and the coalition hadn't fought on culture war issues enough, and that's why Dutton lost the election. I mean, the idea that you could look at this, a Peter Dutton-led coalition, who's very much on the right of the party, who spent his last week making Welcome to Country the centerpiece of his election campaign, and say that wasn't far enough on the culture wars. Like, I don't know what Peter Credlin is imagining she wants, what the ideal version of going hard enough on culture wars is, but it just seems crazy to me.
I mean, what's that phrase? If the only tool you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? Like, these guys have been inculcating themselves in this culture war stuff and just egging each other on for so long. They probably genuinely believe that this is a thing that matters more to other people. And I think they look at Trump and they genuinely convince themselves the election was a rejection of wokeness and DEI, right? And I think it might have been an issue around the parts, but they're not willing to grapple with the fact there's so many factors. And even Peter Credlin's talking about cost of living. Like, that totally was a factor this election. But no one thought that Peter Dutton was better on that issue. Like, his only policy on that front was fuel excise, which did not resonate at all. So they can't quite accept, I think, the reality of what is happening right now.
Fully. And just briefly to show that this isn't just Peter Credlin, you know, one of the funniest examples of this kind of thing to me was Chris Uhlmann's election day editorial that went up, you know, when polls were open. It was on the front page of The Australian, and the headline was "Anti-Nuclear Zealotry is just net zero intelligence." And in it, he basically called people opposed to nuclear power idiots and made the case for nuclear power, saying, and I'm quoting here, "Nuclear power is the densest form of energy on Earth." I don't know what that means or why any normal person wants dense energy over non-dense energy, but I just think for that to be The Australian and Chris Uhlmann's election day lead editorial just shows, you know, these are kind of niche obsessions, these are ideas like nuclear power. And a lot of these, whether it's a journalist like Uhlmann or more like a commentator like Credlin, you know, right-leaning media loves to kind of claim the mantle of being common sense and in touch with sort of these silent Australians. I just think that the election, as well as being a real huge vote against how Dutton went about this campaign, it's a vote against those people really having some connection to some unknown majority of people. They could not be more out of touch, I think, with what resonates with the Australian electorate.
Yeah, I agree. We talked about this last week, and the surprise that I felt seeing the Australian Financial Review editorialise on the issue of Welcome to Country ceremonies 3 days out before a federal election. It just felt totally disconnected in terms of like what their readership or what the Australian public at large really cares about. And I think it does speak to this media ecosystem that these people are operating in, right? You've got Australian and Daily Telegraph and Herald Sun journalists talking to Sky News people, getting Liberal and National Party and One Nation and Palmer people on those shows, and watching YouTube videos and X videos from the far right in the UK and Europe and America, and thinking that this world in which they live in is representative of the Australian public at large. And it's not to say that there aren't people that hold those views. Like, obviously, this is a repudiation of Peter Dutton and the Liberal Party at this current moment. Australia still remains a country with significant problems when it comes to things like immigration policy and treatment of Indigenous people and a whole bunch of cultural issues as well. But it's quite clear that the kind of packaging up and selling of that in this really far-right extreme framework is not something that Australians at this point in time felt like they wanted to embrace, right? And I think ultimately what happened here that I think really helped Labor was it became very easy for them to make this election a referendum on Peter Dutton, and not just the issues that he stands for that you've been talking through, and not just these culture war things that people like Yeoman and Credlin have pushed him on, but Dutton's entire history as an Australian figure, right? Like he is very well known within the community as someone who has attacked Lebanese migrants, African migrants, and the attacks on the Welcome to Country. These attempts late in the game by sections of the media like 60 Minutes to try and humanize him and him bringing his family along, it just felt like too little too late when he's been a national figure for over a decade. And I think Labor just helped sharpen people's minds and said, look, you know, we know that the economy is not going well. Like, they would admit this. They said, we know people are doing it tough, but look at the guy who's in charge right now, Anthony Albanese, and look at this guy Dutton who's running around saying he's talking about flags, right? He's talking about Aboriginal flags, and he's talking about Welcome to Country ceremonies. And I think he was his own worst enemy, and he was Labor's best asset this election campaign.
And just generally on how Dutton was covered, particularly in the final days, I thought it would be worth mentioning, you know, we had a bit of a light pop at sections of the media last week for maybe not calling out how badly this campaign was going for Dutton, and that it sort of appeared to clearly not be going well, but there was a sense of wanting to keep the contest tight. And I think it's worth mentioning that sort of in the final days, we did see a bunch of major networks do those kinds of stories. On Thursday, Nikki Sava in the Nine newspapers called Dutton's effort one of the worst election campaigns in living memory. And that same exact morning, Laura Tingle at the ABC called Dutton's campaign a disaster. But we are seeing more of that now, obviously, now that everything's said and done and we can see the result. David Crowe, chief political correspondent at the Nine newspapers, I caught him on Insiders, and he said, look, the Liberal Party were just not ready for government after these 3 years in opposition. And listen, I do think there's something interesting here, Oz, about a phrase that I know that you and I both love, which is the "now they tell us" piece, which is, I think we're now going to get a lot of journalists writing pieces about the chaos inside the Dutton campaign, what went wrong, that kind of tend to come out only when things go off the rails in the aftermath, when it's all said and done, but often are things that the reporters had at least a hint of for quite a while, and speaking to insiders kind of knew that it was going badly. And I just think as people start to write those pieces and read those pieces, it's kind of worth asking why that's the case, and whether in these kind of situations, whether it's to preserve contacts, to kind of get them over the line, whether journalists kind of sometimes can hold on to that stuff a little bit too long, rather than push to get those stories out earlier, if that's what the case is with a campaign like Dutton's.
Yeah, I think a lot of those reporters are the hedging, right? They might have a feeling things aren't going well, but they don't want to go out a few days before the election and dump on the guy who might be the prime minister, because we live in a moment where politicians, remember, and they are more ruthless than ever in terms of how they manage relationships with journalists. And so if you're the guy that said this campaign sucks and it turns out Dutton won, you're probably going to be out in the cold for the next 3 years and not going to be getting a lot of good drops, tips, leaks, and stories from the PM. I also think, even though you hear whispers, right, on the inside from the Liberal camp in this instance saying things aren't going great, most of the people in the party don't really want to say that to journalists. They want to keep up the pretense that they've got a chance, you know, that we could win in these seats, and if, you know, actually the polling's wrong and there's going to be this big burst of One Nation preferences that get us over the line. So the sources tell these journalists things are going good. But when everyone loses their seat, there's no point in maintaining that pretense anymore. So they call up and say, it was a fucking disaster, and here's like 10 reasons why things went wrong. So we're starting to get all that kind of stuff come out now that will lift a lid on what exactly went wrong in this campaign.
Exactly. There's very good reasons why some of these stories can't be reported earlier. It's very hard to get people to agree to go on the record or off the record with this stuff before it is said and done, and it's hard to do that. But I think there's kind of an interesting question about, you know, if it were not for Tingle and Sava and those pieces on Thursday, we may not have had really anything before Election Day that kind of pointed to just how dysfunctional things had gotten inside a Liberal HQ. But anyway, it's going to be a fascinating story to watch that party try and rebuild itself now, whether it even can, and we're definitely going to keep an eye on it on Lamestream.
Absolutely. All right, let's take a break and then get stuck into the performance of the Greens and some of the independents. Scott, in our pre-election episode, we highlighted a few non-traditional contests that we thought were keeping an eye on. At the time, the polls were suggesting a minority government was on the cards, and those seats would have been more consequential because they would have helped decide who forms government. That didn't end up happening. Labor's got a very comfortable majority. But a lot of those seats we discussed did become close and pretty fascinating contests. So that we just whip around and sort of update people on where things are at there. The Teals look like they're going to hold all of their seats, though Goldstein, Zoe Daniels' seat, is going down to the wire. They could also pick up Bradfield in Sydney's north off the Liberals, so the Teals look like they're either going to hold or go forward, and that's eating away at Liberal heartland. It's making their job even harder election to election. Other independents we mentioned that are giving Labor strong challenges, that's Franklin in Tasmania and Fremantle, which I think is turning into a bit of a boilover. There's a very, very close race there between the Labor MP and a Climate 200-ish independent. In Hunter, we flagged that One Nation was a kind of a wild card factor there. Labor has held them off, but One Nation did overtake the Nationals to become the second biggest party in that seat, reaching 40% of the two-party preferred vote. So Labor's clinging on, but that's a seat that One Nation keeps making inroads in and something to watch in future elections as well. Let's talk about the performance of the Greens. They were talking a big game ahead of this election, and they were looking to retain all their lower house seats, and they were talking about winning, potentially 5 to 10 more seats in the lower house. I think on that measure, in terms of the goals they set themselves, they've definitely underperformed. They just didn't reach the goals that they said that they were going to. But the story is actually not that straightforward. The Greens' national vote has held up, and in the Senate, they actually got a swing to them. So not really this wholesale repudiation of the Greens as a political force, but it's clear that in the lower house, things did not go to plan. They've lost 2 of their seats in Queensland, Max Chandler-Mather and Stephen Bates in Griffin and in Brisbane, respectively. But it's worth noting there wasn't really a backlash against them either. In Chandler-Mather's case, what happened was the Liberal vote collapsed so much that party slipped into 3rd place. Their preferences are now getting Labor over the line. In their 3rd Queensland seat of Ryan, they are leading, but it's too early to tell if they'll get over the line, which leaves them with Melbourne, where there was a swing against party leader Adam Bant, but it looks like he will hold on. And the only other seat that they are in contention to win is Wills, which is a Labor Greens contest and is too close to call right now. I think what we'll see in the media, Scott, is a lot of stuff about this being a disastrous result for the Greens, and partly that's kind of their own fault for setting expectations so high. The media narrative is going to be they were too extreme, they blocked too much of Labor's agenda, they were too anti-Israel. That's not what Australians wanted, and they were wiped out based on that. I think, as I mentioned, the numbers don't really bear that out. The actual vote hasn't shifted, and what's really happened is there's been these dynamics, in particular lower house seats that they expected to do better in, they didn't, but in seats they weren't targeting. There's outer suburban seats in Sydney and Melbourne, particularly seats in Sydney, in the southwest and in the west, with high migrant Muslim Arab populations. They got the biggest votes they've ever gotten. So I don't think there is evidence to support the narrative that is already emerging in the Australian, in the Nine newspapers, even on the ABC, in Laura Tingle's analysis this weekend, that the Greens are being rejected for their position on some of these issues, like Israel's war in Gaza. But all of that said, I think you would have still expected that after a very, very moderate centristy Labor government that hasn't been particularly bold on climate or social or economic issues, you'd think the Greens would have done better. I think Labor here was very successful, as we said, in making this election a referendum on Peter Dutton. I think in that context, the people who might normally vote Greens were spooked by the idea of someone like Dutton becoming PM and just said, I don't want to mess around with the minor party vote. The stakes are too high. I'm going to go straight to Labor to stop Dutton winning. What do you reckon?
Yeah. When I spoke last week about wanting to see more coverage of the Greens and what was happening with them at this election, that wasn't necessarily because I thought that the campaign was going terrifically. I'm not saying that I could have known exactly this, but I think there were definitely some tensions within it, I suppose. And that isn't from knowing anything about what's been going on or conversations that's being had. It's just by looking at the kind of campaign that was run. I think Bant obviously made a conscious choice that rather than campaign on housing, which was a huge issue, or obviously make Gaza a focal point, he decided to focus on dental in Medicare at the center of this campaign. And I think it's really interesting to ask whether that was the right call, whether that was enough of a contrast with Labor to motivate people to put Greens number one, which is what they need to win these lower house seats. Was that enough of a contrast with Labor to create a kind of passion around getting people to put Greens one?
So just to pick up on that for a second,
please.
You mentioned housing. I think that is a really smart observation because the Greens housing spokesperson, Max Chandler-Mather, who lost his seat, was effectively sidelined at a national level in this campaign. I think there was quite clearly a strategic decision made that for whatever reason, the Greens thought that he wasn't a useful spokesperson, and kind of as a result, housing, which they'd made such a totemic issue for 3 years, wasn't front and center. And they made this like pivot to dental and Medicare, which great policy, and the toothbrush stunts were fun and whatever, but they just seemingly hadn't really laid the groundwork for that, right? And so you saw Gaza and housing, which had become these big issues for the Greens, move to the side in favor of these other policies, and perhaps that was just kind of too confusing. It didn't help them get cut through in certain areas, but at the least, it's really, I think, observant of you to pick up that happened, because I don't think there's been enough conversation about the Greens' actual strategy rather than this like meta-narrative that they are quote-unquote too extreme.
Yeah, I think the extreme thing, I mean, it is a great fallback for political journalists to just say this is outside the regular terms of the debate. That must mean that people, that the public don't like it. We don't really know, but it'll be interesting if people get really into that, what comes out. The one thing I also wanted to mention just on the performance of the Greens and the independents and things is, you know, we obviously have talked a lot about how voters have been abandoning the major parties. And as we mentioned, you know, there has been a little bit of a reversal of that trend with Labor's primary vote. They gained 2% as we're recording, it looks like. And look, I just thought it's worth mentioning that's a pretty major achievement in a lot of ways, because I think a lot of people, including myself, thought that trend was baked in, that the major party primary votes were just going to decline and decline and decline. You know, Anthony Albanese needed to reverse that trend if he was going to have any long-term kind of ongoing path to majority government. It looked like maybe the days of anyone winning majority government could be over. So look, I'm sure that there will be much to say about both Anthony Albanese as a politician and the way that the media cover him, and we'll have plenty to say on that. But I think it's worth mentioning that that is a fairly significant achievement for kind of the future prospects of the Labor Party and them being able to win majority, which they obviously did on election night.
Yeah, really good point. And in the interest of accountability, which is something that, you know, we feel passionately about here at Lamestream, you know, I made some predictions. You were too smart. You were smart enough to make predictions, and I predicted, you know,
I think I obviously backed yours, by the way.
The key prediction we made on a Labor minority government didn't happen. Labor won. Happy to own up to that being something we missed the mark on. And the other things we talked about were the Greens picking up either Wills or McNamara. Could happen in Wills, not likely to happen in McNamara. And Labor having a potential risk to independence in some seats. And I've mentioned some already that they're probably going to hold on to. But there's actually two races, Scott, and this is based on counting on Sunday, that a few electoral analysts and Labor folk as well are starting to get a little bit nervous about. Seat of Bendigo in regional Victoria and Calwell in the outer north of Melbourne. Very, very, very safe Labor seats. Big swings on in those seats. Labor is potentially going to lose to the Nationals in Bendigo and potentially to an ex-Labor Party independent in Calwell. And I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know enough about the specific dynamics, not seats that I was keeping an eye on, but it's just interesting that even though there's this broad theme emerging that Labor has achieved this historic result, there are still warning signs for them. In the regions, in outer suburban areas, there is an anti-politics mood. There are people who have voted Labor their whole lives who are feeling taken for granted, and we saw it happen with Fowler, a historically safe Labor seat last time around, went to independent Daly. She's held on to that seat this time. It's nowhere near as dramatic as what's happening with the Teals and the Liberals, but it is a significant force, and I think it's something that the major parties will be stressing about, even if they win, the huge majority that they're expected to. And kind of the final thing I wanted to say on that, and I don't want this to be like a negative note. I think a lot of our listeners are probably quite happy that Peter Dutton is not the Prime Minister, but there are warning signs, Scott, from like all around the Western world that even if you manage to win a thumping parliamentary majority, And as much as we want to take some solace from the fact that Australians didn't buy into this Sky kind of after dark culture war campaign, there's still massive risks for a party like Labor. You know, our good friend Keir Starmer, a Labor leader in the UK that I think neither of us have an enormous amount of time or respect for, won a huge majority, right, last year. And the thing was, Keir Starmer is the new Tony Blair, and he's beaten the Corbynites, and he's brought Labor back into this centrist-y position. We know that Keir and Albanese have talked regularly. There's a lot of information trading and strategy trading going on between those two parties. Keir modelled a lot of his campaign on Albanese in 2022. So there's a reason to bring up that comparison. Despite winning a huge majority, I think, of over 150 seats, Labor's vote has collapsed within a year. The far-right Reform Party is surging. It became the biggest party at council elections last week. And the point just there is you can't take anything for granted, right? If you're a progressive, this is undeniably a better result than if Dutton had won. But it's still very much in the air what kind of government Labor will be in its second term. It's very much up in the air how the media will respond to this, whether they'll acknowledge the misread the mood, particularly those on the right. But I just think that there's still a chance that things get a bit wobbly and there's a bit of uncertainty. And in a way, for people like us who are pundits, that's exciting, right? It gives us something to talk about. I'm looking forward to doing it with you over the next 3 years and beyond.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think, look, we know that economically, life in Australia and life all around the world is, we've been reminded of it recently, that the winds in the economy are very turbulent. We're living in kind of uncharted times with technology and how capital is flowing and all kinds of things. And also the information environment is weirder and crazier than ever. And that includes our business, the media. And so when those things happen, tables can turn very quickly on sort of centrist or, progressive governments very, very quickly. And, these are not normal times, and very kind of normal politics may not be what we see in the coming years, despite a kind of Labor majority and what would be seen as a very traditional outcome in a lot of ways from this election.
Very well put, Scott. That's it from us. If you enjoyed the show, we'd love it if you could leave us a review or share it with a friend. You can also email us questions or tips at contact@lamestream.com.au. Scott, see you Thursday.
See you Thursday, Oz.